Thank you everyone for being here with us today on such a hot afternoon. I'm very pleased that we have today's the occasion to host Jennifer Cobbe. Over the past few years and over the past few months, the chair has had the occasion to discuss the various aspects of the digital transition, but it's probably the first time that we have the opportunity to question the merits of this transition or to question the merits of technology, even if today we'll be talking about a rather extreme way of looking at technology, because Techno Chauvinism implies that technology can offer the best solutions to the majority of social problems. We can also speak of Techno Solutionism. So we are very pleased that Jennifer Cobbe accepted to write a study on this acute question, and we are also very honored that Daniel Handler accepted to chair this conference. So with no further ado, I will leave the floor to Professor Handler and to our guests. Before that, I just want to thank our partners, Soprasteria Next and the Caisse des Dépôts et Consignation for their constant support. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurence. Thank you for asking me to chair this important event. I'm very pleased this is maybe the beginning of a collaboration between us two personally and also my institution, which is École Normale and the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, and then Sciences Po. And so we have a very distinguished set of speakers today, and so I will not waste too much time. I will immediately introduce Dr. Jennifer Cobbe, who is affiliated with the Department of Computer Science and Technology at the University of Cambridge. And she's also a member of the Microsoft Cloud Computing Research Center and lots of other things. And she has a PhD in law and a master's degree in law from Queen's University, Belfast. And so please, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Do you have slides on? I'll go next. Yeah. There is a PowerPoint on the desktop called, I think this is called Techno Chauvinism Talk. Okay, cool. Brilliant, thank you very much. So today I'm going to talk about Techno Chauvinism, which was an idea first proposed by the computer scientist, by the computer scientist Meredith Broussard in her 2019 book, Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World. Broussard shows through many real-world examples in this book the problems of techno-chauvinist thinking. And today I'm going to discuss techno-chauvinism as described by Broussard. I'm going to try to put techno-chauvinism in its context as a strand of techno-utopianism. I'm going to try to critically examine some of the core techno-chauvinist assumptions and beliefs, and I'm going to try to set out some ways that we can avoid thinking about like a techno-chauvinist. So first of all, what is techno-chauvinism? Well, Broussard defines techno-chauvinism at a very high level as the belief that tech is always the solution. Techno-chauvinism is characterised by a blind optimism about technology and a lack of caution about how digital technologies will be used. Broussard identifies several fellow traveller beliefs that techno-chauvinists often hold in the objectivist ideas of Ayn Rand, in techno-libertarianism, in maximalist understandings of free speech, and in the supposed objective and unbiased nature of computers, but also in the idea that social problems will disappear if only we can use more computers. So these kind of things should give you an idea of the kind of thinking found in techno-chauvinist worldviews. So through Broussard's book, she identifies 5 key elements of techno-chauvinism, which I'll briefly outline. First is blind optimism and a lack of caution about technology. So this includes beliefs in the reliability and objectivity of machines. Broussard argues that this has manifested in society more generally in a sort of general assumption that the users of computers are to blame when something goes wrong, even when it's kind of more likely to actually be a problem with the machine or its design or its development or that kind of thing. Second is a lack of concern for social issues, with very little concern around the social impact of what they're doing. Broussard says that this means a lack of concern for gender issues in particular, but also other issues around race and other forms of marginalisation and exclusion. Techno-chauvinists, according to Broussard, tend to believe that inequality and structural problems can be dealt with, as she puts it, at a keystroke. Third, and relatedly, is a bias towards a white male point of view. Broussard argues that computer science has inherited gender stereotypes associated with mathematics, which of course computer science kind of grew out of, and that as a result, computer science imposes masculinized norms which carry over into industry and the culture around digital technology more generally. The fourth element of techno-chauvinism that Broussard identifies is a strong belief in individualism. So she argues that this first evolved on the online communities of the early web, which were often strongly libertarian in their culture. And she relates this to a more general lack of concern for the social issues that I discussed just a moment ago. And fifth, and I think this is really important, is a belief in disruptive innovation. Broussard argues that disruption and disruptive innovation are seen by techno-chauvinists as a way of generating huge profits. But she argues that the incentive structure for technological development is warped by the chasing of investment and by venture capitalist funding, with more emphasis on hype than on making tech that works to actually help solve social or economic problems. The blind optimism and faith in new technologies, as well as the lack of concern for social consequences, and the belief that more technology will solve social problems, marks techno-chauvinism out as a form of techno-utopianism, I think. So over the years, there have been many different techno-utopian visions and projects. These typically seek or depict radical social transformation through technology. The Italian futurist movement of the 1910s to 1930s, for example, emphasised speed, dynamism and technology, and it glorified modernity and thought that electrification would help banish poverty, disease and work. The futurists embraced nationalism, violence, war and the National Fascist Party of Benito Mussolini because they saw him as a modernising force. The 1933 World's Fair in Chicago celebrated scientific and technological progress under the slogan, "Science finds, industry applies, man adapts." And the 1939 World's Fair in New York glorified technology with the slogan, "Dawn of a New Day." And it promised visitors a view of, as they put it, the world of tomorrow, where rational planning could seemingly harness the power of technology and bring about a utopian future rooted firmly in visions of the triumph of American capitalism. Techno-utopia has also found its place in popular culture, although kind of dystopian depictions tend to be somewhat more common. The Jetsons was an American cartoon from the 1960s, which depicted a family living in an imagined 2062. The Jetsons married futuristic technologies like flying cars and jetpacks with new ways of living in cities in the clouds. And this imagined society of 2062 was happy and efficient and had no obvious social ills or divisions. But while the Italian futurists became fascists and the World Fairs and the Jetsons reflected visions of capitalist techno-utopia, Harold Wilson, who was the British Prime Minister for parts of the 1960s and the 1970s, sought to use estate planning to harness, as he called it, the white heat of the scientific and technological revolution for national economic renewal in a kind of vision of like a socialist techno-utopia. Wilson was probably more modest in his ambitions than some of the other techno-utopians, but he did believe that the state could direct scientific and technological research, and in doing so drive economic prosperity and bring about a transformation in living standards. And the socialist government of Salvador Allende in Chile in the early 1970s also sought to combine new technologies and state planning. But while Wilson's vision was to use economic planning to direct technological development, the Chilean government's Project Cybersyn sought to manage the Chilean economy by combining new technologies with the insights of cybernetic theories. In theory, Cybersyn would decentralise economic planning and maintain the democratic role of workers, in contrast to a more Soviet-style centralised command economy. Now, these are only a few examples of techno-utopia over the decades. Each depicted or sought an optimistic future where new technologies brought widespread transformations, and each exhibited the kind of blind optimism about new technologies that we find in Techno Chauvinism. But they also displayed a techno-chauvinist lack of concern for social issues and a white male bias. They rarely portrayed technology as bringing about a major change in contemporary social hierarchies or in the position of marginalised or minoritised groups. In that sense, techno-utopianism is often somewhat conservative in nature and reflects the social conditions of its time rather than looking to reject or improve upon them. In the Jetsons' imagined world of the 2060s, for example, the fundamental social dynamics of 1960s America are largely unchanged. The Jetsons are a nuclear family with happily married heterosexual parents and 2 children. The father, George, is the sole breadwinner. He travels to work in a flying car rather than by public transport, and he works in an office under an overbearing boss. Jane, the mother, is a homemaker, and her primary role is as a wife and caregiver. The family's robot maid, Rosie, is coded as female, which we can see continuing in Google and Amazon and Apple's AI-powered assistants. And all of the characters in the Jetsons are white and none are LGBT. Elsewhere, the futurists' utopian vision glorified misogyny, and the 1939 World's Fair failed to imagine women as much more than sexual objects. Wilson's White Heat of Technological Progress and Allende's Project Cybersyn, which each sought socialist economic transformation and had some degree of class analysis, actually had little to say about the liberation of women or people of colour, LGBT people, or people with disabilities. Similarly, techno-utopian visions, projects and worldviews of today, including techno-chauvinist ways of understanding and discussing the role of technology in society, often show little concern for issues around gender or racial equality or the rights of LGBT people or of people with disabilities. Techno-chauvinists might imagine an optimistic vision of a technological future, but they often lack sufficient understanding of the world of today to imagine a more radical departure from its social hierarchies and inequalities. And in that sense, the techno-utopian vision is often somewhat conservative in nature. And within techno-utopian thought, including techno-chauvinism, we can identify 2 basic assumptions. First is the idea that machines are just better than humans at certain tasks, and that their use will consequently bring about a general improvement in society of some nature, although, like I say, often in quite a conservative kind of way. And second, the corresponding idea that machines can solve human problems in a way that humans themselves actually can't. Now, there might be some truth to some extent in these ideas in relation to certain types of machine applied to certain kinds of problems. But techno-chauvinists wrongly generalise from that really quite small grain of truth, and so often seemingly conclude that technology is inherently better than humans and can solve virtually any social problem, if only it can be leveraged in just the right way. A common techno-chauvinist assumption is that machines are better than humans at a wide range of tasks, and this has been mainstream in techno-utopian narratives for really quite some time. In Harold Wilson's White Heat speech in 1963, for instance, he claimed, and I quote, "Computers have reached the point where they command facilities of memory and of judgment far beyond the capacity of any human being or group of human beings who have ever lived." This, of course, wasn't true in 1963, nor is it true in 2022. Computers might have a significant advantage over humans in terms of, say, memory or in terms of mathematical computation. But humans are generally still prepared for things like discretion, reasoning, understanding, consideration, and other characteristics of judgment are required. In principle, of course, computers are better than humans at certain things. I don't think there's any real doubt about that. And that's particularly things involving some form of information storage and retrieval, or some kind of, like I say, mathematical computation. And other machines have in the past and in the present been better, in quotation marks, than humans at a wide range of things. But it's important to understand what's meant by better in many discussions of digital technologies. Typically, when machines are described as being better than humans at a particular task, what is being referred to is an ability to perform that task faster, or more accurately, or more consistently, and at lower cost. These are often kind of collected under the misleadingly innocuous sounding heading of efficiency, with little regard for the harmful or damaging external consequences of the use of machine, which are generally written off as externalities. Take the example of the power weaving loom. So this is generally accepted to be better than hand weavers at producing woven fabrics in bulk and at low cost and at speed. But even this reveals the nature of what the power loom was actually better at: producing woven fabric A, quickly, B, cheaply, and C, in large quantities, which are all priorities of a particular form of political economic rationality of the industrial capitalism of mass production which emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and of the subsequent forms of capitalism which followed. In that sense, it's not the case that a human could not complete the task of weaving given enough time, training, or resources. What people generally mean when they say that a technology is better than a human is that by the measures of the market, a human will take too long, or will cost too much, or will produce inconsistent outputs compared to a machine. By those market measures, computers are often indeed better than humans at particular tasks. But that doesn't mean that machines will outperform humans at any task, nor does it follow that it's possible to design and build machines that are better than humans at any task. So when a machine is considered or described as being better at a particular task, we should consider who is served by the measures on which that conclusion is grounded. So for whom is the machine better? Let's return to the weaving loom. Before the late 18th century, weaving was primarily done by a workforce of skilled craftspeople in the domestic system. Weavers would be contracted to produce fabrics from raw material using looms that they worked at home. But advances in weaving technology, from the spinning jenny to the power loom, allowed cloth to be produced on a much greater scale and for weaving to be mechanised and eventually automated. This move from small hand looms, which were affordable to individual weavers, to more complex technologies like the power loom, which were not, was accompanied by a major change in the ownership of the means of production. Instead of looms being purchased by home weavers who could no longer afford them, they were purchased by a factory owner who could, and the factory owner also purchased the weaver's labour to operate them. Because home weavers were left with no hope of competing with the factory on the critical market measures of cost, speed, or volume of production, they really had little choice often but to submit to this. The factory system thus replaced the domestic system, and home weavers were forced into factories and into positions of dependence on and exploitation by factory owners. Of course, advances in weaving technology were not the only cause of this. That was really only one complex process among many that produced and constituted the Industrial Revolution, and there are a lot of things going on there. But developments around weaving machines that were sort of better at producing fabric according to market measures did play a major role. And these transformations enriched factory owners while forcing home weavers into new positions of subordination and exploitation. So better is an ambiguous term. Even if machines are better than humans at certain tasks, and they often are, that doesn't mean that they can bring about some kind of general improvement, though they might bring about some specific, often financial improvement for a particular actor. The second key assumption in techno-chauvinist thinking is that computers can solve otherwise intractable human problems if they're used in just the right way. Of course, machines are often helpful in addressing certain real human, social, or economic issues, But the broader assumption in techno-chauvinist thinking is faulty for, I think, two related reasons. The first is that many social and economic issues originate in social, economic and political choices, so they're not necessarily problems of a kind that can actually be addressed by computers. Second is that machines are human-made and reflect the worldview, assumptions, goals and priorities of those who design and develop and deploy and use them. And these may often align with the ways of thinking that actually produce the problematic social or economic issue in question in the first place. So let's very quickly take these in turn. So where technologies can help with some social or economic issue, it's because their particular design, capabilities and affordances lend themselves to doing so. And there are undoubtedly some things that computers are particularly good at. These broadly relate either to computers' capabilities as information technologies or as communications technologies. But as Broussard argues in her book, computers are good at some things and really very bad at some other things. And many problems arise where people misjudge how suitable a computer is for a particular task. Many social issues have their roots in chronic underfunding of social services, or in underfunding of education, or in lack of employment opportunities, or in economic inequalities and exploitation, and in other issues stemming from political and ideological choices made by politicians, policymakers and governments. Many are arguably unresolvable without structural social and political economic change. Yet technologists often identify real difficult social issues, but misunderstand their causes, such that more technology seems like the best way forward. Often the desire, unfortunately, isn't so much to create a solution for a problem, but to create a product that will bring a profit. The solving of the problem is supposedly the means to get there, but it's ultimately incidental to the actual goal. The second problem with the techno-chauvinist idea that machines can solve human problems is that machines are human-made and reflect the worldview and assumption and goals and priorities of those who design, develop, deploy and use them. As Broussard argues, the blind optimism about technology exhibited by techno-chauvinists typically involves false beliefs in the reliability and objectivity of machines. But we don't need to look to digital technologies to understand the social nature of technology. Knives and spoons and forks, for example, are all kinds of cutlery, but each affords the user a different capability, making them suitable for different actions relating to the eating of food, and this relates very much to their design. So it's not just the case that technologies are socially constructed, as Broussard says, but they also afford different kinds of behaviour and interaction, and afford different kinds of social effects and relations. Ultimately, all technologies are social phenomena. They're produced in certain contexts, according to certain contingencies, worldviews, assumptions, priorities, blind spots, and goals. And they afford certain kinds of behaviours, actions, and interactions that also depend on context and perspective. Now, techno-chauvinists implicitly understand this. After all, if technology could not affect social relations in some way, then the idea of using technological interventions to address social problems wouldn't make any sense at all. But what's often not understood by techno-chauvinists is that because technologies are social phenomena, how technologies can affect social relations depends on the interaction of a large number of influences and processes, most of which are not technological in nature, like related social issues or legal limitations or permissions or political economic context, or other structural and systemic factors that influence designers, deployers, users, and anyone affected by technology. Yet these are often exactly the kind of social issues that Broussard rightly points out techno-chauvinists are unconcerned with. Because technologies are social phenomenon, and because they're produced in particular social, legal, and political economic environments, they're often the product of and reflect the very ways of being, of thinking, and of doing that underpin the problems they're purported to solve. And because they're social, technologies are often therefore of the problem, and therefore unable to solve the problem. Yet for some, machines offer a seemingly kind of technocratic tinkering with symptoms of socio-economic problems without addressing their origins in political economic order. As a result, techno-chauvinist thinking often obscures the need for a broader understanding of problems and a wider set of interventions than techno-chauvinists can usually admit. So finally, what can we actually do about techno-chauvinism? How can we think about technology in ways that aren't techno-chauvinist? So I propose 5 questions to ask that can help combat techno-chauvinist thinking. And these should really be asked anytime somebody is considering trying to address some social or economic issue using computers. The first question to ask is this really a problem? Often the supposed problems to be solved by computers actually bring certain benefits to certain people, as Evgeny Morozov points out really well in his book about Techno Chauvinism. So what would be lost if the problem, or the supposed problem, was solved? If the thing being discussed as a problem serves some socially beneficial purpose, then we should really tread very carefully. It might not be perfect, and there might be improvements that we can make, but properly understood, it might turn out to not actually be a problem at all. The second question is, if the thing is really a problem, then what kind of problem is it? What has caused this problem? Where do its origins lie? And is how we've come to understand it as a problem the only way that we can understand it as a problem? Different ways of understanding things as problems might point us in the direction of different ways of dealing with them, which may be more effective. And the third question I think we need to ask is this kind of problem amenable to computational intervention in particular? What are the possible interventions that might help address this problem's causes? Are they ones where greater information processing power or better communications would help? Reaching uncritically for computers might obscure other ways that this could potentially be addressed. So, are digital technologies actually required to help with this? Or are human organisational or structural reforms needed? These might be more mundane, but they might also be more effective. The fourth question is whether the proposed technology is the right kind of technology for this kind of problem. Is the proposed technology appropriate to what you want to achieve in addressing the problem? Are there other kinds of digital technology that could similarly help? Might they be more appropriate? Or to put it another way, as something that comes up very often in techno-chauvinist discussions, do you need blockchain or do you just need a database? That's the kind of question we should be asking. And finally, I think we need to ask, who are the right people to develop a particular technology to address a particular problem? Because technologies are social, it matters who designs and develops and uses them. So, do the people producing the technology understand the social context of the problem? And do they understand its causes? Do they have the background and perspective to understand the consequences of implementing the technology? I think it's really crucial that the people who are likely to be affected by new technologies are properly centred in this process and are made an important part of decision making, not just kind of consulted in a sort of tokenistic kind of way. Now, of course, you might work through these questions and decide that a computer system is the best and most appropriate thing to use. But that conclusion, I think, can only be reached by rejecting techno-chauvinism. So this means we need honest assessments of how socioeconomic problems arise in the first place. Often they're the result of structural inequalities, or ideological projects, or economic factors, or, let's face it, past misguided attempts to address social problems with technology. But if we ask these questions, then perhaps we can find ways to make the most of technology, while acknowledging that the important work of addressing human, social, economic and political problems often just can't be delegated to machines. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I can hardly imagine how you managed to pack so much in just 25 minutes, under 25 minutes. My congratulations. So now we have two discussants. I don't know in which order would you like to speak? Beatrice first, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let me briefly introduce you. You are an assistant professor of law at Sciences Po here, and also an affiliate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. And as your predecessor, you hold a doctorate in law and a master in law, this time from Harvard Law School. And you're also a lawyer in Bogota, Colombia, where you come from. And you have many other qualities and interventions and so on. But that's about enough for now, and now you have the floor.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and Jennifer, thank you so much for that amazing talk. It's such an honor to be responding. So I see this presentation, which is also part of, or there's a policy brief, for those of you that don't know, on this, as a really important addition to the critique of the reckless adoption of technology and the gathering of data that we see in our daily lives. There's an app for everything. And I think something that is very, very special about the piece and your talk is actually right at the end, the practical steps that you offer to sort of avert some of those misadoptions of technology, let's call them, but also perhaps the warning that the uncritical adoption of technology comes actually at a cost. And I think in many spaces in society, we don't tend to think so. So techno-chauvinism can lead to harms of people who are not included in the decision-making process of how to adopt a particular technology that might affect them afterwards. It often leads to simply wasting resources that might be valuable and could have been used elsewhere: talent, time, public money. And then, of course, I think one of my favorite insights from your talk and your piece is that it is also actually hindering how we think about the future, because techno-chauvinism, and in an interesting way, contrary to many of the techno-utopianism examples that you show, or as part of them, constrains the way that we think about the future to those individual, maybe white male, maybe. So actually, it's conservative. And I say that as someone that was actually a fan of the Jetsons growing up, but also there's nothing very different in the Jetsons from the Flintstones. And I think there's something valuable about trying to take a step back about how we think about technology and imagine perhaps better, different, radical futures. Maybe a bunch of places in the world could do some of that right now. So what I want to do with the rest of my time, I don't want to take a lot of time, is I want to tell you some reflections of how I see this intervening in my work, and then ask you some questions about how you think about techno-chauvinism in a particular set of examples. So I work in the governance of smart city technologies. My work is actually about how do we adopt, how do we regulate technology in cities, and how we govern the data that these applications collect. These are things that are everywhere in our daily life these days. You might have come here using a Velib, an e-scooter, you swiped your Navigo pass, maybe. That's digitization of public services. And there, you might have taken an Uber if you were very, very late. Well, that doesn't really work in the global north, but you might have taken an Uber last night from a party, I don't know. But the digitization of cities happens also at the government level everywhere, and we see a lot of what you're mentioning. So data sets are used, and with good intention, to improve the efficiency of a bunch of city services, from water provision, energy efficiency, how and when is the trash being collected, and so on. All those processes are increasingly intermediated by data and algorithms. And there's actually a big movement. I don't want to say a big movement because it's not that big, but there's an important movement in academia calling for the type of space that you're calling for, actually defining the problem. Do we actually need these technologies to solve the type of city issues that we're dealing with? I want to ask you, so your key insight, I think, is that that technologies might not always be suited to solve human problems that originate in social and economic causes, because those technologies that we're going to use are also based in those social and economic causes. So the technology that we're trying to solve the problems will be a product of the same social and economic circumstance that we're facing, and therefore it might have the same obstacles that the problem we're dealing with. So I wonder how you think beyond the questions at the more political economy level about the entry point to try to disentangle the endogeneity of all these issues, because ultimately how we think about the problems and how we conceptualize them is also a function of those factors, and is also a function of the tools that we have at hand that might not be only computers but other sorts of technologies, the institutions, maybe not only technology is everything, right? So also the infrastructure, not only computers. And then I'm curious, if we're thinking only about computers, then everything looks like a nail. If it's a hammer, it looks like a nail. But then if we have a set of tools to address a particular issue, maybe are we still conceptualizing problems as a function of those tools? And then how does that constrain taking a step back, the type of taking a step back of techno-chauvinism that you're calling for, rightfully so, but I wonder in practice. And I have 2 examples to exemplify the type of thing that I'm talking about. So a few years back, when I was doing my PhD, this COVID pandemic thing started. And I was reading a lot about tech solutionism and so on. And then came the techies, and they said, week 3, we're going to develop vaccines. This is what's going to happen. And I was full mode anti-tech solutionism, and I was thinking there's no way we're going to develop vaccines. It's never been done. This is a techno-solutionism approach. Of course, I lost my bet. We did have machines in record time. But I think one of the interesting things that happened there, institutionally speaking, was that there was this historical movement of capital and investment that really changed the whole and moved the whole apparatus to actually make that impossible thing at first sight happen. So at some point, the problem, what I'm trying to show with that example is that at some point, everything is so connected that I wonder actually what the potential of taking a step back is if everything is a function of technology. Maybe something there is disentangling technologies from computers in particular. And so the affordances of computer might be different than ours. That's an alternative. A second example that I see a lot in cities, which is what I work on, is that many city officials are actually, and contrary to some of the scholarship, very sensitive to this type of thing. They really do want to have focus groups. They really do want to have social services instead of more policing and so on. But they have serious institutional constraints to do so. So they say, yes, I know that this other thing will be so much better than an app, but actually I have money for an app. I don't have money, because you have the grants are typically pegged to something. So the money is for an app, and I'm just going to do the best app that I can. I can't hire that additional person. Or, yes, it would be great to do this with that infrastructure, but actually I have this path dependency thing. And so the software that we're using is already that one, and we're just going to go with it. So there are institutional and path dependency constraints to actually take this step back. And I wonder about how you think about those. But thank you so much. This was amazing. And I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Excellent comments. Thank you. Compact and to the point. And now I think Hubert Etienne will be giving us his comments. He's a philosopher conducting doctoral research in AI ethics and computational philosophy at École Normale Supérieure and also Meta AI. And he's also a lecturer in AI ethics at Sciences Po and HEC and all sorts of other things. And he's currently a visiting fellow at Harvard. So, Hubert, it's all yours.
Can you hear me? Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is an honor to be here today, and thanks for this amazing presentation too. I think philosophers tend to focus more on questions than answers, and I think the two questions arise that I'm most interested in. When you say, what do we mean by better? When we say machines do better than humans sometimes, and we tend to assume that better is better decision, more rational decisions. So I think this one is very crucial to understand the kind of technology we're building and the types of interactions we want to develop with them. And they're not humans yet. And the second question is, who should build these machines? And I think this one is very important to address very, very urgently. And also, as you were speaking, I was actually thinking about quite an unconventional reference, but I don't know those of you who know Spider-Man, but I remember when I was young, Spider-Man and Batman, it was about the villain and the good guy. And the good person was actually good because he or she was fighting with the villain. So it comes back to the idea in Leibniz on the Theodicea. You need a bit of bad to have good. And I don't know if you watched the last one. In the last one, they say, actually, bad people, we can fix them with technology. And this is exactly what the hero tends to do. They develop something on a computer and say, we just need this injection, and the bad person becomes good. And I think that is the best illustration of what you were saying I found recently in the movies. So I will try to be brief. There's two main points I wanted to comment on what you said. The first one, I think you raised the question of gender issues in the development of these technologies. I don't think you used the term this time, but I think it's present in the reports, the term bias, when we talk about gender biases. At least this is like the generic term we use to refer to this issue. And I think it's important to focus on this one just for a minute, because I think actually this term is very dangerous. Everybody uses this term all the time, and at the end we don't know what we're talking about. And I will just explain why I think it's dangerous. The issue is here. I guess we all agree on this one. We need to do something about diversity. The reason why I think it's dangerous is because it tends to lead to a confusion between what we call in statistics a statistical bias. And if we take the example of AI, AI is statistics at the beginning. It's just different type of it, and very applied statistics. And in statistics, a bias is a systematic tendency which causes difference between results and facts. So this is something recurring mistake between what we expect as what we call gold truth or ground truth and the results of the algorithm. But what is important here is that we have a comparison between the results of our technology, like the outputs, and something which is said to be like the gold truth. Just to give you an example of observation bias, when you put a stick in the water, you see the stick twisted in the water. So you have an observation bias because it seems to be twisted, but it's not. We know it's a refraction index, and so if you put your hand in the water, you can see that actually it's not that what appears to be. So we can actually verify the results of our perception by putting our hand inside. And here we have a comparison between a natural fact and an observation coming from us. When we look at the work of cognitive or behavioral scientists, they talk about cognitive biases, which is a difference between the way people behave and the way they would behave, we think, if they were pure rational beings. So the comparison point here is between an ideal of rationality and the way people behave. This is how they say that we're biased in many ways. And of course, it doesn't mean anything in terms of morality. It's not, nobody said that more rational people would be happier or more ethical people. It actually tends to be the perfect opposites. So we don't want to rationalize people, but that's what we're doing anyway. And so just to finish on this one, when we talk about racist opinions, for instance, we're not comparing people's behavior with a natural fact. We're comparing people's opinions with a moral standards that we have for society, and we say, and legal also, and we say this is not acceptable anymore. But here, the ethics come at play in the judgments. And I think it's important because when we make a confusion between all of these, and I'm not addressing, sorry, specifically your presentation on this one, but the framing that the academia has given it, we say, okay, what do we mean by bias? It's cognitive, it's statistical, it's judgment. And at the end, we say we want to get rid of biases. And get rid of biases means rationalizing people, because we assume that it's a rational question. And then you have people like transhumanists who say, and it's very explicit in the Transhumanist Manifesto, everything is bias. Social, religious, political, ethical opinions, this is all biases and we need to get rid of it. And the main point is that if we could just unify people, get rid of all these biases, we would all agree, because if we're all pure rational beings, that we don't even need to communicate anymore. I mean, we all have the same opinions, which are not opinions anymore. And so, yes, this is just the first one I wanted to make on, I absolutely agree on the question of diversity. And I think it's not just gender diversity, because there were some improvements in the tech industry on gender and LGBT inclusiveness, less on intellectual diversity, having social scientists in the labs, much less. But this is a very, very core question, I think. I want to emphasize on the fact that most of the time when we talk about biases, like we need to be very careful on this term. And the second point that I wanted to address quickly, when relate to the question when you say, so what do we mean by machines are better than us on some things? And I was mentioning transhumanism because to what I understand from your presentation, Techno Chauvinism, to me, seems to be kind of the peak of the iceberg, where on the very deep inside we have this paradigm of transhumanists. And just to give you very in a nutshell, we had the Enlightenment where we said, with the French Enlightenment, okay, no, people are not determined anymore. God is dead, Nietzsche said it, and so we can be whoever we want. And then we have Sartre, existentialism, our essence is not defined, so pretty much the sky's the limit. And this had three major consequences. The first one is that it unleashed desires. People had the sky's the limit, so they want to be God. Anyone wants to be God. The second one is that there's an unlimited competition, because desire is mimetic, and so at the end of the day, we all compete for the same things, and we all fight to each other. And the third point is that, unfortunately, when we all compete for the same thing, and it's something we cannot have all together, we have one Elon Musk, and we have billions of people who don't succeed to be Elon Musk. And so you have a psychological distress of people, not only because they failed, but because they feel that the full responsibility of the failure is on their own. And so this is what philosophers call the crisis of modernity. And I think it's very, very linked to the development of modern science and this idea that we wanted to become God. This is clear in Descartes, mastering the nature. Today with transhumanism, mastering the nature of human. We want to hack human beings, hack the brain, just to unleash the potential of the mind. And we glorified our rationality so hard that we tend to hate our bodies more and more, and we just want to get rid of emotions, our cognitive biases limiting our rationality. So to this question, artificial agents are better than us. I think we really need to address it, because if we just assume it, we will end up having what we already see as a speech in the academia and the technosphere, where people say, anyway, they take better decisions than us, so we should just get rid of our free will and let algorithm decide. And at the end, you cannot even oppose to the algorithm because you're limited. And the algorithm is purely rational, so of course, it's having better decisions. And there's one philosopher, I promise this is the last philosopher I quote, Jean-Michel Bessier, who's French, and who used a term very interesting. He talked about the tiredness of being. So following the Enlightenment, this huge burden of responsibility that we had, we're responsible for every single action. And if we fail, that's our own failure. He said at the end, we're tired of making decisions we feel responsible for, and that's why we actually have this desire, this fantasy, to just build something that would make all decisions for us. And I think this is very problematic. Of course, if we don't stop it, we will end up, as Sloterdijk say, sorry, one more, very last one, to have two different species of human beings, those who are actually enhanced by the technology and who master the others. They would be either migrated on the metaverse, I don't know, with the consciousness only on the computer. They will be linked to the computer, what Neuralinks tend to do. And we will have the others who refuse to be enhanced, and they will be mastered by the framers. So we will have superhuman and end-dimension. This is clear in the Transhumanist Manifesto, and this is, I think, at least this is like the concern, the biggest concern I have, and I think it relates very much to what you call, what you discuss as Techno-Chauvinism. And I will just finish on two questions for you. First of all, do you agree with this link I make between transhumanism and techno-chauvinism or not? And if so, please give me some hope for the future, because I see very little room for escaping the catastrophe. And the second question, you said, who should develop it? Once we have a better idea of what we want in the, for instance, in the AI labs, what are the practical leverage we can actually trigger in order to force or encourage companies to align with what we expect from them?
Good. Thank you very much, Hubert, for being so relevant and brief. So I have a few comments, but I'll put them off because I think there's a lot on the table already for Jennifer. So I think you should try and respond to your two discussants, and then I'll see if there's any time for my own.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, both of you, for those very, very interesting and very useful comments, I think. To come to your question first was, what can we do if everything is constrained by technology or by institutional kind of factors or by other things? And how does that constrain how we think about these things and how we approach these kind of questions and what we do with them? I think in general what we need is, it needs to be a deep structural but also cultural change in how we think about social problems. It's not even, I mean, we need to change how we think about technology, but we need to change about how we think about technology in relation to social problems, but particularly we need to change how we think about social problems. So the example you give of the city, which somebody says, I really want to tackle, this, maybe some variety of poverty, some neglected neighbourhood, but actually I've only got the money to build an app that might allow neighbours to, I don't know, report a broken something that they can get fixed. Okay, fine, but that's obviously that's somebody doing their best within the constraints of that institutional system that they're part of. But what we really need is the cultural change in how we think about social problems, to understand that it's not so. I mean, it's one thing to help people, report something that's broken. It's another thing to make sure that things don't get broken in the first place, or to make sure that societies are properly funded and properly supported in the first place, and that actually we can't just turn to a sort of post hoc kind of app to try to resolve these problems. We do need deep transformation at a socio-economic level. So yes, we're constrained in many ways in how we think about these things. And I liked your vaccines example because, no, I don't think anybody sensible or realistic thought that we would have vaccines within, this is never going to happen. What are you talking about? And then it happened because people threw the weight of the world behind vaccines, which I suppose to some extent shows that with enough resources and enough will, you can kind of achieve a lot of things. But we don't have the same cultural will to change the deep social problems that people try to solve with technology. And it's notable that perhaps the main driving force behind all the funding that went to developing vaccines was because companies realised that they were going to take a massive economic hit from the pandemic and wanted it to be over soon. So when companies face economic problems, problems can get solved. When ordinary people face social or economic problems, we throw them an app and say, well, this is the best you can have. And that's the kind of cultural change that I think we need. We need to really rethink these things, not just in terms of, thinking about, well, can an app solve this? Well, probably not, so let's not have the app. But in terms of how do we build communities? How do we develop communities that are properly supported, properly resourced, and where these problems don't come up in the first place? That's the kind of change that I think we need. It's a much bigger project than just rethinking how we relate to technology or how we relate to apps. I think is probably the way forward. And in relation, to your questions, so could I clarify? One of them was, what do I mean by when I say technology is better than humans?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I don't think technology is better than humans. My point in the policy brief was that when we say that technology is better than humans, this is often something that we conclude, or people conclude, based on measures about technology that are market-driven. And so people often conclude that technologies are better because they're faster, or they are more efficient, or they can produce an outcome more cheaply, or with fewer staff, or more consistently, or whatever it might be. But those are all market measures, which suit a particular sort of form of political economic rationality of kind of capitalism and that kind of thing, but also particularly of tech capitalism and of the kind of disruptive innovation kind of logics that come through in a lot of this techno-chauvinist thinking. They leverage these kind of logics to make arguments in favour of the disruption which they want to pursue, which actually is dismantling human, social and economic relations and reconstructing them around the app that they want to sell you, because then you become dependent on them and they can extract value from that dependency. So no, I think often machines, when you think of things from a different perspective, I think machines might often be worse than humans. It's a question of perspective and a matter of perspective. Now, it might be the case that from the kind of perspective that I adopt, machines might be better in some way than humans at certain things, in the sense that they might produce some kind of benefit according to some particular metric or some particular measure. But actually often they're not. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at, is that when we say machines are better than humans, that's often according to particular logics that I think we should reject, and that we need to, if we had the kind of cultural transformation that I was talking about in relation to Beatrice's questions, then we might we might use different measures to to understand these things that we might come to the conclusion that actually machines are rarely better than humans. And I think that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to get at. On your transhumanist point, I do agree completely that there is a strand of kind of transhumanist thought around techno-chauvinism. But I think that's, I mean, so Jeff Bezos is like the perfect example because he's full-blown transhumanist, wants to escape the planet and build like some crazy colony off in space where everybody can do it. You know, he's full-blown, fully bought into it. But he's also very much a techno-chauvinist. They often come hand in hand. I mean, yes, I'm sure plenty of people who we could call techno-chauvinists aren't transhumanists, but they might subscribe to certain bits of transhumanism, or they might have ideas or perspectives that we could locate within transhumanism. So I think, yes, there is a link there, and there's a strong strain of transhumanism in the tech industry more generally, particularly in the kind of like higher echelons of Silicon Valley. But also if you go on Twitter and you find these people crawling out of the woodwork when like Elon Musk tweets about going to space or something, they're there, they exist, and they also will usually be the ones who are like uncritically retweeting things about NFTs saving the world or something. It's often the same people because it's the same basic mindset, I think, that underpins it all. So I think that's an excellent point, yes. Oh, the other question, what levers we can use to change who develops technology? It's very difficult because a lot of the mechanisms that we might want to leverage in some way, whether they're in the media or increasingly in education or in government or in the tech industry or wherever else, kind of basically subscribe to this worldview. And not transhumanism, but techno-chauvinism, though often they also subscribe to transhumanism. I think what we need to build social, cultural movements outside of those kind of traditional areas that are often sort of captured by this techno-chauvinist worldview. We need to build alternatives, and we need to build movements that can produce the kind of social change we need. But it needs to be grassroots and from the bottom up, which is a particularly unsatisfying answer because that's an exceptionally difficult project to do. And it's not simply a matter of saying, well, here's a couple of levers to pull and we'll solve this problem. But it's a long-term, deep project that's kind of bottom up, and I think that's what we need to do for this, if that answers your questions. Thank you.
So, that's great. So just to pick up on the last thing and to give optimism to Bear, I think this grassroots movement is actually happening, and it's quite powerful. I think there are lots and lots of groups all over the place that are indeed trying to do a reset. For example, this reset of the internet. But there's a sort of a general movement towards a reset, an anti-techno-chauvinist reset. And so I think there's hope there. The other hope is that, most of transhumanism is bullshit. It's not going to happen. So we don't need to worry. And part of transhumanism is both very attractive and very dangerous. I'm referring to the part of transhumanism that says, look, humans are really particularly cruel species. We can hardly read the newspaper these days. Ukraine and incest and rape and all forms of cruelty. And so it's not entirely irrational or entirely unfounded or crazy to think maybe we could improve the human species on the ethical level. After all, wouldn't that be a good thing? There'd be less cruelty, less evil, fewer wars, and so on. So I'm not a transhumanist, but that's the strand of transhumanism that I think is somewhat attractive and certainly interesting from a philosophical point of view. So I don't want to take too much time because I think there's, there'll be questions and challenges in the audience. So let me first say that I'm very in broad agreement with the gist of the report. And in fact, to show you my credentials, many, many years ago, most of you weren't born, I put my steps in those of Hubert Dreyfus. And Dreyfus was the philosophical critic of artificial intelligence on the basis of AI being, first of all, unfeasible at the time. That was true, as a matter of fact, but also as sort of the apex of a certain rationalistic stance which he found both unrealistic and hateful. So I was entirely on his side, and I've remained basically on his side. Nonetheless, I want to put a little pressure on what you said and on the report. So first, it seems to me, but please tell me that I'm wrong, that to some extent, you're aiming at a straw man or several straw men or straw people. Now, who really believes that data are pure facts? I mean, who believes that? Who really believes that wicked problems, social, economic, and so on, are solvable by computers? Who has brought forward a single example of a wicked problem that's solved by computers? So I think this whole thing is discredited, and of course, a few fanatics, but maybe we shouldn't be overly impressed by them. And who believes that, as you say, or as Broussard says, some problems have been solved or eased with the help of certain technologies? Yes, of course. Does not lead to the conclusion that all problems can be solved with technology, or that where technology has been helpful in one particular area, it will be similarly helpful in resolving any problems. I don't run into people who think that way. So maybe we shouldn't pay too much attention to those fanatics. A second observation or question that I want to address, to put to you, is that a lot of what you said is now very much in tune with this broad movement which includes the rise of the ethics of AI, AI for good, human-centered AI, and so on. So it's putting the techno-chauvinists, whoever they are still, on the defense regarding bias, deleterious social and political effects, and so on. So isn't what you have been reporting on already in the making, so to speak? Or do you think that more should be done, or are we going in the right direction? The third remark I'd like to make is that in your presentation, you seem to think it's helpful to run together several strands, and I'm not sure it's so helpful. So the strands that I'm thinking of are what I call hyper-rationalism, what I might call technophilia, and then what might be called digital automatization. Now, of course, digital automatization is very much part of a technophilic framework, so I can see why you would want to run them together, but at the same time, as I think Hubert has been hinting, it's true there's something very special about the machines that are computers. They're quite different from previous technologies, and I'm not sure it's so necessarily helpful to sort of say, well, we had washing machines and steam machines and so on, and printing and so on, and now we have computers. So I'm not sure. But what I am a little bit more sanguine about is that hyper-rationalism is a much older tendency, goes back to the Greeks, in fact, and it should be criticized as such. While, on the other hand, digital automatization can be put to the service of non-hyper-rationalist project and non-hyper-rationalist worldviews and techniques. So, putting them together seems to say, well, if you're going to go all the way to, if you're going to say computers are great, you're necessarily going to buy into a hyper-rationalistic worldview. And conversely, if you reject digital automatization, you're ipso facto going to avoid the pitfalls of hyper-rationalism, which is not the case, clearly. So that's another question I want to point to you. So I want to make my, as I said, I want to make my remarks short. So maybe just one thing that you're going to find maybe a little obscure, because it's a central thought I have, which I try to develop in my book, and I may not be able in just a few minutes. It's about this idea of problematization. Now, I don't think you mentioned the word. You didn't use the word in this presentation, but I read the report, and it comes from this guy Morovich or something like that.
No.
No. Okay. Anyway, problematization. It seems, from what I understand in the report, you problematize it, and it's always political. You see, you problematize in a political way. And it seems that it's wrong to somehow ignore the fact that problematization implies a number of social and political and economic and capitalistic choices. But I want to argue that there's always a step of problematization when you go from a concrete situation to an actual problem, which you can then try and solve by rationalist means, or with the help of computers, or with the help of deliberation, and so on. And so it's not just a matter of bad guys with ulterior political and economic motives who are running the problematization. We all do it at all times, because when we're in a situation, then we have to say, what is the problem? And just to give you one example, I think in the report you mentioned the case of some social service that's underfunded, and so you have an app to try and sort of repair, which is like a Band-Aid on a terrible social ill or wound. And you say, well, the real problem is that it's underfunded. Wait a second, that's going too far, too fast. That's your decision somehow, your political, moral, ethical, social decision to go from a situation in which there's just not enough money to take care in a human, personalized way without a machine, and you say, let's have more funds. But suppose you don't have more funds because, you know, there's an emergency here or there. So we are in a concrete situation where somehow a certain kind of social service cannot be rendered in full in the old way as we would like. And so we're in the situation, and then we have to problematize. And problematization does not necessarily automatically lead to the idea that the service is underfunded. Maybe it's, you know, it's your choice, basically. So with this, I will let you respond.
Okay, thank you. I'll sort of work backwards from that, if that's okay. Back to your original point, so I think, on this problematization point, so problematization is a concept that I am drawing largely from sort of Foucauldian kind of literature on questions around government and on power and that kind of thing. I would never have claimed that problematization is something that's just bad guys with ulterior motives. It's something we all do all the time, but it is also a political process that we all do all the time. It's tied up in questions of power and ideology and worldviews and all the other kind of things that we talk about when we mean things are political. So yes, we do it all the time. As a society, we do it all the time. As individuals, we do it all the time. We come to understand things as problems all the time, and that often is accompanied with certain ways of then intervening upon the problem as we've come to understand it. And usually those two come, not always, but usually come hand in hand. So yes, you know, I'm not quite sure where your point was with that, other than to sort of argue that I seem to think that problematization is something done only by bad actors with ulterior motives, which I don't think is at all the case, because the sort of theoretical kind of strain of thought that I'm drawing that from would argue exactly against that. It would say that actually it seems it's very much tied up with questions of power and thing that everybody partakes in processes of power rather than power being something possessed by somebody and sort of withheld from others. But on the point actually about the funding, so in Broussard's book, she makes what she does in her book is she works through each chapter a particular kind of thing that she's encountered in her sort of life as a computer scientist and things. A lot of it's kind of sort of semi-anecdotal, but it's using that to tell the broader story. And one of the stories she tells is, or one of the sort of anecdotes she tells is that she went to a school, I think it's in Philadelphia, where they didn't have enough books. And they didn't have enough books for all the kids in the classes. And the ones they did had were old and kind of battered and kind of falling apart. And the major reason they didn't have enough books was that they didn't have the money to buy new books for the pupils. And the school decided that the way to deal with this was to institute a computer program that would manage the allocation of books to people based on some complicated, algorithmic process. And her point was that actually this didn't really work because, for a start, nobody knew how to use this computer. It had kind of been imposed on them, and no teacher had the time to sit down and learn how to use this system. So they kind of just muddied through whatever. But the other point was that actually, even if you did use this system, it wouldn't solve the underlying problem of there just not being enough books because there wasn't enough funding to pay for the books. And that's the kind of thing that she's talking about whenever she talks about there not being enough funding. If people want to buy more books, that's going to need money.
Good point.
Yes, and so then to your next point about computers being quite different from previous technologies. Yes, they are, but I think all technologies are different from each other. But we can identify certain common ways of thinking about technologies, or common ways that technologies work or do work in the world. And one of the things that I would argue is that technologies allow people or afford the possibility of people, because it's not so much what they allow, it's what they afford. And affordance is very contextual. Affordance depends on the perspective and the understanding of the person who's approaching the technology. So I might look, a cup, for example, I might find that a cup affords me different behaviours than you might find. So technologies afford people certain kinds of things that they can do for other people. But that, of course, is very much contextual and dependent on a wide range of features, as I say. But when people do things for each other, that creates, to some degree, a form of social relation between them. And it produces a form of, in often cases, a form of dependence between them when you become dependent on a function essentially being performed by somebody for you. So whether the technology is a computer or whether it's a cup, although a cup might not create a dependence, but you understand the point. Whether it's a computer or whether it's a cup, we can look at how these different technologies afford these different kinds of functions. And we can look at how those different kinds of functions can, in concert with a lot of other processes going on, whether that's social or legal or technological or political economic, we can look at how those functions produce different forms of dependence and interdependence between people. And what kind of effect that can have, not necessarily always, because I would always reject sort of technological determinism, but what effect that can potentially have in structuring social relations in particular ways, or in structuring forms of political economy in particular ways. And I think if we understand that computers are different from cups, of course they are, but the way that process of producing interdependence between people operates can be seen as being common across different technologies, I think, and that's the kind of thing that I'm sort of trying to get at, particularly when I'm talking in the report about how weavers became dependent on, factory owners, which of course it's quite a reductive kind of approach to looking at the widespread transformations of the Industrial Revolution, but it's kind of just to make that argument. Putting techno-chauvinists on the defence, yes, you're right, that is already happening, but it's also kind of happening in some ways in ways that don't necessarily reject the premise of techno-chauvinism. So AI for social good often actually still basically assumes that if we just throw some AI at something, as long as we deal with problems like bias and these kind of things, then AI can still allow us to produce some real great transformation that'll solve some problem. And AI for social good as a movement, and I am picking on only one of the examples you used, but AI for social good as an example, as a movement, has been quite widely criticised for not rejecting those kind of underlying assumptions of techno-chauvinism. So you're right, but often the way that techno-chauvinists have been put on the defence isn't really, it's not putting us in a completely different frame, if you know what I mean. It's still accepting some core kind of premises, even if people don't mean to. Partly because I think the techno-chauvinist viewpoint is so widespread in society now, it's kind of become so unconsciously accepted by so many people, and I find myself falling into the same way of thinking sometimes about things, and I'm sure lots of other people sometimes find themselves thinking this way about things, even if we know that it's, even if it's, we can call it a catchy term like techno-chauvinism. And then these other questions of who believes social problems are solvable by computers and who believes that data are facts. I'm very jealous of you if you don't encounter these people. Sadly, I do. In fairness, that could be a product of spending too much time on the internet. So I'll give you that. But I do encounter these people in the real world occasionally, And sadly, they're often the kind of people, I work in a computer science department, so I encounter them actually more often than perhaps I should. I encounter my students thinking these things. I encounter fellow members of my department thinking these things. I encounter our alumni thinking these things. And a lot of our alumni in the Cambridge Computer Science Department work in Silicon Valley, work in big tech companies. These worldviews are, I mean, they're not, there's an extent to which that the techno-chauvinist thing is kind of a pastiche to some extent of what they think, but the basic worldview is there in a lot of people, and I think that's kind of, yes, it's kind of, it is to some degree a straw man, but there's a lot of truth, I think, also to what's there. And on the final point, to come back to the transhumanism thing, it is bullshit and it's not going to happen. I completely agree. But we also have to, I think, the people who tend to believe that also tend to believe in things like long-termism, where they don't really care about the problems of today because they think, well, in the longer term, it'll work out okay. And of course, they will be the ones who it'll work out okay for because they're usually wealthy and white and often male. And for them, they don't really need to worry about the problems of today because in the future, they'll be fine. But it brings me back to this Industrial Revolution analogy that I'm kind of using, that we can look back and say, well, the Industrial Revolution was kind of worth it, wasn't it? Because it didn't modernity bring us lots of good things. But if I was working in some mill in, Victorian Manchester in 1850 or whatever, living in some cramped house with like 15 people and my children all dying of like typhus when they were 4, I probably wouldn't think it was that good. So you're right, it is bullshit and it's not going to happen. But the people who believe in it are potentially quite dangerous because they overlook what we need to do to solve the real social problems of today to improve lives for people now, rather than their kind of imagined future, which, yeah, it's fantasy, but it's also a distraction and an obfuscation and a movement, a sort of a rhetorical movement that takes us away from things that I think we need to address in the here and now, in the present. So I agree, but we should also take it seriously.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very enlightening. So now I think there's some minutes left, not many, unfortunately, but if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question or challenge the speaker or the discussants, there's someone there, out there. Maybe the event is recorded, so it might be better if you speak in the mic.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. So I want to pick up on the last thread when you were talking about how technology should improve people's lives. And this also relates a bit to what you discussed earlier about biases and the white male issue. I think that when we talk about technology, the only thing which would bring through diversity would be to factor in social class. Because if we bring in more geographically diverse people or more women or more LGBTQI people, but who come from the same social background, technology would still work for the rich. And also looking at the questions you have on the screen right now, when we talk about problems and what we want to solve, we see technology doing minor fine-tuning, which helps the rich. We see lots of new devices such as automatic cleaners and cleaning robots and stuff like that, which actually does make changes for the rich. But then who is working on improving the lives of the poor with technology? Who spends any time thinking of coming up with an application which would maybe help a cleaning lady arrange her schedule? We all think about the managers and the CEOs and the busy people there in the big metropolis. So I'm just thinking, how can we make sure that technology also takes care of those who are worse off? And how can we ensure diversity in terms of social class? Thank you.
I completely agree. I mean, yes, I'm a socialist, so I agree with what you're saying completely. Part of what I'm trying to get at with this is that often people try to throw technology at problems that are fundamentally problems of like class, for example, or of the fact that we live in a capitalist society where, the means of production are owned by a small elite and the rest of us are kind of left with whatever we have. And that produces deep social and economic problems that you can't just throw an app at to solve. You need that real structural economic transformation to solve those problems. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with this. So I completely agree. And maybe it would really help cleaning people who work as cleaners if they had apps to do these things. But maybe we should also build a society where people aren't relegated to the bottom and paid pittance to clean people's toilets. Maybe that's how we should. I agree. But yes.
Do we have other questions?
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Questions in the chat. Go ahead.
So the first one is from Pierre Noro, and he asks, so he says that this idea of techno-chauvinism is becoming prominent today under different labels, also including, for example, tech exceptionalism. And he thinks that a common counter-argument that is often brought up to these ideas is that innovation produces experiential goods and services whose utility can only be accessed after having experienced them. So is the ex-ante evaluation of the service and the need that it answers fully compatible with innovation?
Can you repeat that?
So he said if innovation produces goods whose utility can only be assessed after we've experienced them, is evaluating services and the needs they answer before we create them, would that be a barrier to innovation?
There's this kind of thing known as, I don't know if anybody knows it, called the Collingridge dilemma. It's like, yeah. So it's kind of, you can't really understand the problems of a technology until it's kind of been used and you know, but then once it's been used, you get things like path dependence and lock-in that mean that you can't really roll it back. You can't get back from it. Which I suppose actually is quite similar to the point that was being made there, that we don't really know until after we've used the technology what the effect of that technology is going to be and whether it's going to be something that we want to critique or whether it's something that's beneficial, and then what do we do about it, and so what can we do with that in advance? That's an exceptionally difficult question. I don't have an answer to it because I don't think anybody has a satisfactory answer to things like the Collingridge dilemma, other than to say I acknowledge the question and I accept that it's an exceptionally difficult thing to do, and beyond that I'm not going to try to answer that question because I think it's impossible. Yeah.
Something. I'm going to just add something to that question. There's this wonderful book called Meaningful Inefficiencies by Eric Gordon. And it's also actually on city planning, and it's about how policymakers can add spaces to solve better problems. And that's where my intervention goes to. And the book adds with an example that I love. It talks about, so the city of Boston wanted to change the time at which high school started because teens need to wake up a little bit later, according to science. So they were going to start high school at 9 a.m., let's say, but that required rerouting the buses of the public schooling system citywide. And so they hired MIT. And the MIT developed this hyper-complex algorithm about how to move the buses around the city to take the high schoolers later to school, but that was like the trick part of it, involved also changing the schedules of elementary school students, because there were like a limited amount of buses that were going to moved all kids around. And so some elementary school students' schedules also got really badly moved, and parents got very, very mad when this happened, because it sort of wrecked their daily life, you know. So now you had a kid who started at 7, the other started at 9, the one got earlier, childcare is very hard. And so what Eric Gordon calls to about innovation is that it's not necessarily that. So one of the crucial questions might be actually what kind of innovation do we want? And then also what kind of problem are we solving? So maybe a way to find a middle ground, I'm curious on your thoughts of course, is to include the people to whom, what's the problem that we're solving and for whom. And so eventually there was like this revolution of parents in Boston. They shut down the program and they did like a bunch of focus groups with parents to understand what actually their issue was. And then they brought the MIT engineers and they did again their fancy algorithm, but with a very complex definition of the problem. It sounds like many of the things that we're talking about is that some of the archetypical techno-chauvinist seems to have narrow definitions of what the problem is. I still doubt to what extent we can problematize not enough function of the tools that we have. So we were thinking about resources and we want to plug in more resources, but opening that type of spaces to defining the problem is not that we're against innovation, is that there's maybe a better space to then have innovation afterwards.
It fits the 5 points, concluding points very well, in fact, yes.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good story, and I will have to read that book because actually it sounds very relevant and interesting. I think in general, when it comes to the concept of innovation, I think I mean like, you know, people in general should be much more critical of the concept of innovation. We kind of assume if something is innovative or if there's innovation, it's a good thing, right? We should promote innovation, but not all new ideas are good ideas, right? Some of them are not so good. They may be harmful, or they cause parents to get up in arms because they've got kids going, So yeah, I think that's. I will read that, and yeah, I guess I would generally call for a much more critical take on innovation. That yes, it's possible perhaps to have a new idea about how to run schools or what time to have schools open at, but just you do need to you need to have new ideas produced in the right way to be able to do these things. You can't just throw, like MIT seemingly tried to do, throw an algorithm at something and go, well, that's that problem solved. Let's not care about externalities. Therefore, you don't have to care about them. So it's that's how it is. I'll read that book. That sounds great.
There's another question on the chat. Is there?
Yeah, there's one more question if we have time.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Ahil Sheikh asks, would you advocate for completely rolling back policies and technologies that could be regarded as techno-chauvinist if they emphasize overwhelming digitization, such as digital IDs and biometrics and blockchains instead of databases? Would it be better to roll those back completely or to work on those technologies and reform them? And how would political inertia factor into that?
Okay. I think, so part of so if we say something like blockchain or we look at some other technology, actually it doesn't really matter what the technology, but if we say, do we need to reform technologies or do we need to move away from them? I think the thing is technologies are, some technologies are inherently political, but all technologies are political in some way. As of course Langdon Winter showed us 40 years ago. So all technologies are a product of their kind of time and their place and their context. And political, economic factors and legal factors and social factors go into producing a particular technology. So, for example, in ancient Athens, I suppose, writing developed first with a particular alphabet, or writing was adopted first with a particular alphabet, and it was used almost exclusively for poetry and for literature and this kind of thing. And then the Greek Dark Ages happened, and writing fell out of use because there was less writing and poetry and literature and what have you. But when writing came back, it used a different alphabet. It used Linear B, or possibly that's wrong. Maybe the original alphabet was Linear B, and then it used the Greek script. But it was used almost exclusively for administration, things like government and that kind of thing, because there was a different use for it, a different need for it. So what happened was that the technology that was a product of its circumstance was no longer needed whenever that circumstance fell away, and when a new circumstance came along, a same technology came back, but in a different way. So if we think about blockchain, for example, or if we think about other things that were mentioned in the question, can we reform them? Well, those things are products of the political economy of sort of techno-capitalism. They're products of the world that we have today. So can we reform them? That obviously depends on the technology, but very often I'm not sure that we can, because they encode the values and the goals and the political economic circumstances and context that they were produced in into their design and into what they can do. And often what we need is to stop using technologies like that produce a particular form of social relations, or can help produce a particular form of social relations in line with the rationality that produced them, and think of new technologies that work in different ways to produce different forms of, or to help produce different forms of social relation and political economic organisation built on different logics and different rationalities. And I think that's probably what we need to do, rather than try to reform some things, although some things may be reformable, but not all of them will be, and we need to, I think, carefully consider that.
Is there one last question?
Yes.
Yes, so please speak in the microphone. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that one of the problems, that you wanted to recenter the problem of techno-chauvinism more on the question of building sustainable communities, managing the communities, supporting those communities, rather than thinking about how we relate to technology itself. And I wanted to ask how you react to Monsieur Etienne's diagnosis of this sort of intellectual this lassitude, tiredness of being, and whether you think that's an obstacle if we're trying to create a grassroots movement. Is that an obstacle? Do you agree with that assessment? And what would you do about that form of lassitude?
It's a great question. I think we do see grassroots movements, as you pointed out, we do see grassroots movements beginning and not even just beginning, but continuing, that have, some of them are quite recent, some of them have been going for some time. And I think there is an appetite among a minority, admittedly it is often quite a small minority, but there is an appetite for the kind of change that I think we need. But every major social movement that ever achieved anything began with a small minority. So it's not so much a matter of, you know, is that a problem? I mean, it's a problem if it's still a small minority 10, 15, 20 years from now, but I don't think it's a problem if it's a small minority or a minority now. I think we're at a point where we can change these kind of things. I would worry that further down the line, it's much more difficult to change once technologies become embedded in society in a different way. I think we're kind of still early enough in the kind of digital transformation or whatever other term you want to use for where we are now. We're still kind of early enough, perhaps, I hope, maybe it's more hopeful than anything else, to change the trajectory. But I think down the line, probably not. But is it a problem that it's only a small minority now? No. Is it a problem that most people are, as you know, as he describes, not, you know, what was it you described of modernity? The condition of modernity, something like that you called it?
The crisis of modernity.
That's the one, yeah. Yes, that's a concern, but it's not yet an insurmountable problem, I don't think, for dealing with these things. It could be in 15, 20 years' time, maybe in 10 years' time. In fact, the pandemic accelerated quite a few things, so maybe in 5 years' time, but not just yet, I don't think.
As we say in French, il n'est pas nécessaire d'espérer pour entreprendre. So with this, which I will not translate, I think we should very warmly thank our speaker today, Jennifer, and call it a day. And our discussions, of course, and our discussions. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Okay.
Okay, so this is the last session of the academic year. I wish you a very good summer, and hopefully we'll meet again in September, for some of you at least that I can recognize in the room. So thank you for being here and for attending this fascinating conference. And thank you, of course, thanks to all the speakers, and many thanks to Professor Handler for chairing this session. Goodbye.